So again, you are all very welcome for session 2 of the Language of Coaching book club. If you missed session 1, I've been getting quite a few emails and questions about this. So if you missed session 1, I have it all recorded on my YouTube channel. And so that's Language of Coaching on YouTube. If you plug it in, you'll see a number of videos on there. And if you are subscribed to the languageofcoaching.com, you'll also know that's the location where you can see the 2-hour mini course. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, whoa, 2-hour mini course, what about that? I've never been able to access it. Well, simply head over to the languageofcoaching.com. Again, subscribe, put in your email, instantly be able to access a 2-hour mini course, which covers some of what we're going through over these 4 sessions, but not in the same level of detail. And so for tonight then, we shift from a focus on chapter 1 to focus on chapter 2 and 3. So at the end of this evening, we will have concluded our discussion of part 1 of the book. Now, before I get into that though, a few pieces. I said this last time and it bears repeating. So the question is, how do you get most out of this process, out of these book club webinars, but also how do you get the most out of the book? And so obviously what I'm encouraging you to do is before you come on, please make sure you've read the chapters. Now, it's no worries if you haven't. I know a number of people are attending these book club sessions just for general knowledge and possibly to see if the book is right for them. But if you can, I think you'll get far more out of this if you've had read the chapters. Number 2, practice. And that's the key thing throughout the book. If you've probably noticed, I try to give you various activities that you can use to apply the principles, whether it's a simple thought experiment for which you got exposed to a number of those thought experiments in Remember When, chapter 3, talking about memory. But most certainly those practice opportunities increase as the book progresses. The third thing then is apply. Now, what's great is whether you are face-to-face, and many countries are starting to reopen, and I know many of you will start to get back to training, or even if you're still in a remote coaching scenario, try to start applying these principles. You know, tonight we're going to be talking about attention and memory, and to foreshadow, so to speak, when we look at things like attention. If you know you talk a lot, if you know you give a lot of cues, and the suggestion is in the book, how do you get down to that one cue, that one focus per rep? That's something very simple you can apply and test for yourself. See how it works for you and your clients or your athletes you support. And then finally, question. Come into this with questions. Challenge me. Challenge what's in the book. At the end of the day, only through that challenge will you harden your learning and also harden your belief in what you are learning. So 4 key recommendations from me to get the most out of the book as well as these sessions. Now, a final piece of review. I talked about this last time, our journey to a better how, right? That's the overall thesis of the book, elevating how we coach to the same level as what we coach. And insofar as our journey over the course of these 4 sessions, as I said, this evening, at least for me in Ireland, we will conclude part 1, which means we have gone through learn this, pay attention, and remember when. And these 3 chapters form the fundamental pillars, if you would, the bedrock science on which the book is based. Now, I'll be honest with you, while I really enjoyed writing these 3 chapters, are they the meat? Are they the fun stuff? Are they the practical chapters? No, not necessarily, but I tried to make the concepts as accessible as possible through storytelling, using the principles the book is based on to physically write the book. And I still think it's important that you understand attention and memory. Ultimately, though, in our next session, we get to break into part 2, where we start talking about the actual practicalities of coming up with effective cues. And then in the final session, coming up with effective analogies, which then leads us finally into part 3, which also we will cap out when we have our 4th and final session, notably talking about this idea of a roadmap. And so part of the reason I wanted to do this 4-session book club is it aligns to the concepts in chapter 7, the roadmap, giving you the time to lay down these principles, to lay down these theories so that you understand them completely for yourself, making it that much easier to habit form or habit change once you finally get into that live coaching scenario, whether it remains remote or face-to-face. And so tonight we finish with our blue zone, of part 1. So let's kick in to our very first chapter in question tonight, and that's this idea of paying attention. If you've ever heard me speak on the topic, I say this all the time, and I'll say it again after this slide. Attention is the currency of learning. Ultimately, we only learn from the things we pay attention to. So even though the book is fundamentally about language, it's about how our language affects learning, in this case, learning movement. We have to be able to examine, well, what actually goes into learning anything? And that's why attention and memory are what I keep going back to as these bedrock principles, that if you understand them, you actually can appreciate the practicalities outlined in part 2, I feel, at a far higher level. So when we look at attention, as I've shared, it is the currency of learning. But I want to start to illustrate that by deepening our understanding of what attention is. And if we look at how I physically designed the book, each section kind of has this concept of a primer. And so I asked myself, okay, I'm going to write a book about attention, or excuse me, write a chapter about attention. Now, do I just want to go straight to the science and only talk about the limited capacities of attention and how what we pay attention to affects learning, or can we embed some more practical insights around how we shape and how we guide attention? And that got me thinking about the concept, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, around deliberate practice. Now, if you haven't read his book, Peak, the author is Anders Ericsson. He's famous, and he would say incorrectly, for coming up with what is commonly known as the 10,000 hour rule. And I talk about this in the book, and that this 10,000 hour rule was suggested that you had to practice something deeply for 10,000 hours to become an expert. And this was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in his book, Outliers. But ultimately, as hopefully you've now seen if you've read the chapter, it's not so much the amount of hours that you practice, albeit it's a very important variable. But ultimately, it is the quality of that practice that seems to determine learning of just about anything. And the quality and the depth of that practice affords itself very nicely to a discussion of attention, because ultimately, how we design and form the features of practice, and notably deliberate practice, directly shape how someone pays attention during that practice, which then leads on to what they actually take from it. And so I simply took the main concepts that Anders Ericsson talks about in his book Peak, and before that, many of his research articles, and I put it in the context of a little bit of a map you can use to understand the key coaching factors that influence how one pays attention. And so the first factor that I talk about is this idea of goals. And we can look at goals at many, many different levels. But what I'm trying to get you to do with the book and attention is zoom into the physical session itself. And so asking yourself, within the session, are we working on process-oriented goals or outcome-oriented goals? And in the context of the book, process relates to movement process or technique or quality of movement or coordination, whereas outcome is more on what we're trying to achieve: jumping high, running fast, lifting a heavier load. It's of no consequence which one you pick, but understanding that focusing on process versus outcome shapes what I pay attention to. But if you don't have any goals at hand, or micro goals as I call them in the book, then attention is free to drift, to become distracted, to focus on anything. And so what I like to say is this: if we don't focus on something, and ideally the right thing, we can become distracted by anything. And so asking yourself before every session, maybe even ideally before every set, every movement, what is the goal that we are trying to achieve here? Is it more efficiency of movement, i.e. coordination, or is it a specific outcome? From there then, once I've identified a goal, that then lends itself to how I ask the athlete or the client to focus to achieve it. And when we look at focus, and this is just previewing, if you would, what we'll go into in great depth later on in the book, is that our focus can generally be explicit, which means we are cognitively thinking, let's say, about a cue. Okay, it might be push the ground away during a jump, or explode through the ceiling during a bench press, or bounce off the line during a change of direction. We call this an explicit focus because I am explicitly cognitively aware of what I am trying to achieve. But we can also create an implicit focus. And so in the book, I talk about this idea of a rugby example. And so never would I have come up with a rugby example had I not moved to Ireland and worked for Irish rugby. So it's great to be able to bring in some of these diverse examples. And so hopefully it was clear, but let me give a little bit of a synopsis for those that maybe haven't read it yet. And so to generate an implicit focus, it's very simple. How do I get the environment itself to draw down the right focus to solve a movement problem? In this case, the movement problem is the key area of growth. And so I talk about examples of both hockey and I talk about examples of rugby. And so let me use the rugby example. If I have someone who tends to have a very looping pass, and so if you've never seen rugby, basically we have a ball in front of us and we have to pass it behind us, okay? We can't pass it forward. And so what we want to do is have a nice tight pass across the body. And so a technical error that someone might make is they take this long looping pass, which even if it has an appropriate outcome, takes a lot of time. And so if I'm a rugby coach, I might want to speed that up. And so maybe I'm saying things like keep the body tight to your body, or throw it on a straight line, or imagine there's a wall in front of you. You want to keep it tight to that wall, and none of those explicit focus cues are working. Well, equally then, I could have my rugby player have someone run at them as if they're about to hit them and simply give them the cue, I want you to throw the ball at the last minute. Well, think about that pragmatically. If someone is running towards me and I throw the ball at the last minute, I'm not going to have a lot of space to loop my hands in front of me. I'm going to have to keep it nice and tight. And so even though I'm not telling them explicitly, keep the ball tight to your body or throw it on a tight line, whatever the cue might be, I'm out of my area, so to speak, as a strength coach talking about rugby skills. But let's say none of those are working. I simply can create the focus of keeping a tight pass by having something implicit, implied in my environment that forces me to do so. And so I think this is a really important concept, that we drive focus both through what we ask people to think, but also how the environment forces them to think. And in the book, I talk about that being explicit, that's top down, and implicit, that's bottom up. Explicit, I think, therefore I act. Implicit, I act in response to the physical environment. And let me be the first to say, one type of focus is not better than the other. It's just simply the source of the focus. Is it coming through the mind and I likely the coach, or is it coming from the environment? The cool part is, as a coach, you are the conductor of both. You are the conductor of what you ask them to think about and the conductor of what you ask them to respond to. Now, I'm spending a bit of time here making this delineation between explicit and implicit focus because the book itself is on which type? You've got it. The book is about explicit focus. It's about how we use cues to shape the mind to adjust and improve movement. But it's important to note that there are other ways to draw down focus. And equally, I could have written a book, if you would, about the nonverbal and how the environment shapes focus as well. And so it's in the spirit of being inclusive in how we think about this topic and the way focus can be directed through many sources. And arguably, oftentimes, here's the cool thing, you're using your explicit cues to guide them to the right feature of the environment, right? And so implicit and explicit ultimately work together in collaboration to focus the person. So in summary, we establish the goal. What do we want to achieve? We use the focus to guide the mind in service of achieving that goal. That then leads us to our third piece of deliberate practice. And this is this idea of feedback. And so feedback in simple terms is ultimately the information we use to see if we were successful. Did we establish the right goal? Did we establish the right focus? Were we successful in achieving that desired goal? And so feedback then can come in two different forms. It can come in what we call augmented feedback. And again, I utilize these terms not to be overtly fancy, but I want to use the language that is within the skill acquisition literature, that is within the motor learning literature. So if you want to go to Google Scholar or look this up on Amazon, you actually have the terms that the scientific community uses to share and talk about these topics. But in lay terms, what is augmented feedback? It's feedback that comes from an external source. Normally that's going to be, in our case, you, the coach, the trainer, or the physiotherapist or physical therapist. The other kind of feedback is important to recognize is task intrinsic feedback. That's the feedback that is readily available to the person just by the act of performing the movement. So in many sports, there's quite a bit of task intrinsic feedback. You know, if I'm a basketball player, I know whether or not I made the shot. If I'm a golfer, I know whether or not the ball went straight. If I'm a tennis player, I know whether or not the ball was in play and whether or not I won the shot. And so in many cases, the feedback is as obvious to the person performing the movement as it is to the coach observing it. But obviously we know that task intrinsic feedback still is not enough. How many times has your athlete or client said to you, I know what I need to do differently, I just don't know how to achieve it or how to do it? And so augmented feedback is still a critical part of what we do as coaches. And ultimately that is in part what my book is about. It's about how we give more effective augmented feedback to still allow the athlete or the client to own the learning process, to self-correct wherever they can, and just use cues to nudge, to shape, to craft the movement. And so when we look then at augmented feedback, it can come usually in one of two forms. Knowledge of performance, which relates to the movement, the technique, how they physically performed, or knowledge of results, so kind of KP versus KR. So here's the cool thing. Knowledge of performance relates to the movement process, technique coordination. Knowledge of results, that relates to the outcome. You know, how high did I jump? How fast did I go? Out of my 10 putts, how many were within, let's say, 1 meter or 1 yard of the cup, so on and so forth. And as I outline in the book, one type of feedback isn't better than the other. It depends on the individual, the skill, and what you're trying to achieve. But here's the key thing. That immediate feedback is what we use to refresh the goals or refine the goals or reinforce the goals. And by extension is what we use to refine, refresh, or update how we draw them down and ask them to focus. And so feedback quite literally is the information we use to make any updates on the goals and focus that are physically driving the movement itself. And then ultimately, the final piece is challenge. And I talked about challenge in chapter 1, where we talked about the Goldilocks principle, where if something's too easy, I lose interest because there's no challenge. There's no joy from winning because I'm that successful at it. But equally, if something is too hard and I fail too often, I'm never getting that sense of competence. I'm never getting that sense of confidence. So it's about finding that sweet spot, as I talk about from Daniel Coyle in his book, The Little Book of Talent. I think it's principle 13 in that book. He talks about the sweet spot principle. And so ultimately the challenge establishes that physical environment, and arguably the environment I'm trying to gain focus from and information from. And so it's these 4 variables and the quality of these 4 variables that shape how someone physically focuses their attention. And arguably, if you're not giving consideration to the goal of the session, how you're crafting focus, how you're articulating feedback and using feedback to update focus, and then ultimately how you're using challenge to make sure that actually what they're trying to overcome from a movement perspective is correct for their level. If you're not giving consideration to these 4 ingredients, you're leaving something on the table, because these are the 4 ingredients that draw down, if you would, that attentional spotlight that we can then suck the learning into what we will soon talk about within our memory system. So just things to consider when you look at shaping your own coaching practice, knowing that we are going to spend the rest of the book talking about that top right corner, talking about how we use language explicitly to focus the client, the athlete, or the patient. And for those of you that know a little bit more about me and what I enjoy in my free time, you know that I am an avid musician in the form of DJing. So I had to find an area of the book where DJing made sense. And the reality is it fit like a glove. And so what we want to think about is attention is like the music, if you would, being played in a club. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to get all of these dials across goals, focus, feedback, and challenge. We want to get them correct to create the perfect mix that people want to listen to, that people want to dance to, that people want to focus on. And so the cool thing is sometimes you might have the dial turned towards an outcome-oriented goal that you help them achieve by giving them an explicit cue, that you then refine by examining that outcome through the knowledge of results. How high did they jump? How fast did they run? How much weight did they lift? And then you've set the challenge to high simply because you're working with an expert type individual. And so all this is a heuristic. It's a mental model to help you take these varied principles and think about ingredients, giving vocabulary to this invisible thing that we call coaching, knowing that this invisible thing we call coaching is ultimately in charge of nailing down attention. We get attention focused on the right thing, learning follows seamlessly. So now that we've talked about deliberate practice, we've talked about, if you would, this primer for attention, the ingredients we use to impact it, ultimately we can now state again, we only learn from the experiences we pay attention to. And so that's why this is so important. We utilize these ingredients, we dial everything up so that we can focus on the right things, because it's only the things we pay attention to we learn from. And just to illustrate this, I like to take people through a very simple exercise to show that there are many possible things they could be focusing on. There are many possible things they could be learning from in any one moment, but it's through selective attention that they choose not to. And thus, when we are dealing with our athletes, there are so many things that possibly could distract them. They could pull them away from an attentional perspective from the key areas of information you know they need to get better. And so just to illustrate this, I want you to sit there or wherever you are, and I want you to notice, I'm assuming you're wearing clothes, right? I want you to notice how your clothes feel on your body. If you are sitting down, I want you to notice how your body feels sitting in the chair, whether your hips on the chair or leaning back. If you're standing up, I want you to all of a sudden notice gravity and notice how your feet feel on the ground or how your feet feel in your shoes. If you're wearing a watch, I'm not, but if you are wearing a watch, notice how that feels and what that feels like on your wrist. And so you're like, Nick, what's going on here? Why are you asking me to think about clothing, a chair, the ground, a wristwatch? Well, very simple. As soon as I asked you to consider all of those other sources of information, how the shirt felt, how your hips felt, how your feet felt, how your wrist felt, without even thinking, you were able to access that information. Your attention was able to switch from me to that sensory information around the clothing, gravity, the wristwatch on your body. And what that goes to illustrate is there are far more sources of information coming at us at any one time than we can focus on in any one moment. And it goes to illustrate why someone can be present in body, but not present in mind during your sessions. And if they're not present in mind during your sessions, they are not going to be able to gain the valuable insights you are trying to share with them from a learning perspective. That's why I'm stressing this. And that's why a book on coaching has a chapter on attention. And so as we follow on from deliberate practice, we've tried to give you or at least I've tried to give you a very practical way to think about attention and the things that influence it, the variables that influence it. I then took you on a tour, if you would, a little bit of the neuroscience associated with this. And I asked myself again, before I started to write the chapter, what's a way I can tell a story about attention? And as I thought about it, I'm like, well, hold on. How often as coaches have we dealt with someone who wasn't paying attention? We might say mind wandering. And sometimes we assume there's some sinister or malicious intent behind that. They don't like us or they don't want to listen. Sometimes people just get distracted. And so it's this journey of how we go from mind wandering to something captures our attention, that clicks us back to reality, to then this extreme of flow state and being extremely focused on one thing. It's not, what better way to talk about attention than to go through that journey? And so the first, if you would, concept you are introduced to is this idea of out of focus or mind wandering. And from a brain perspective, you learn about this concept called the default mode network. And so basically our brain spends quite a bit of time throughout the day not focusing on anything in particular. Your mind is wandering, you're ruminating, you're thinking about, what did I do back then? What should I do tomorrow? What should we have for dinner? Oftentimes when you're out on a walk, right? Or when you're doing mindfulness, your mind can just drift. And oftentimes, have you ever asked yourself, why does that one idea pop into my mind? Why did that one idea for writing this book suddenly hit me at that moment? Well, oftentimes it's those moments of aha or brilliance that happened in this mind wandering network. And so it's really interesting. On one hand, we're saying we don't want our athletes to have their mind wandering. We want them to stay very focused. We also know it takes a lot of cognitive energy, if you would, to stay focused. And obviously there wouldn't be mind wandering if it didn't serve some purpose. As I talk about in the book, you spend too much time mind wandering in the past or in the future, and you forget to be in the present, it actually can cause a lot of cognitive issues and cognitive dilemmas. But at the same time, a certain amount of mind wandering is quite important. And so to shift from the dark side of mind wandering for a moment, there's a positive side that I talk about in the book. And I think this is quite important. And that is, before you begin your narrative, your dissertation on what's about to happen today and the cues that will follow, sometimes it's very valuable to give your athletes 5-6 minutes during their prep work to allow their mind to wander naturally. Now, you don't have to ask them to do this. They will do this normally. But allowing them to have a little bit of a cognitive break, because imagine, I just drove into training. I just got out of the locker room, or maybe I'm running in from the session, and I'm cognitively, maybe I was in traffic, I'm exhausted, and now immediately we start going into coaching mode. I'm going to argue that mind wandering, especially through a first 5-minute preparation before a session, might actually allow you to get more out of them because you've allowed their mind to basically go into default mode and relax for a moment, to not have the cognitive energy of always being concentrated. So that's one way to think about mind wandering in a positive sense. The other way is, as you go through a training session, are you giving them strategic breaks? Right? Especially if you're doing a lot of cognitively demanding work. Now I'm thinking more professional sport and team sport. Those breaks now are not only to get hydrated, they're also to allow that mind to reset, to allow that mind to wander. And especially if, let's say, you had someone who had a big error in, again, a sport or one-on-one in a movement skill, and you're coaching, and you're not getting that breakthrough. Well, rather than trying to go at them again and again and again, maybe allow them to step away. Say, listen, I'm going to give you 5 minutes. I want you to go for a little bit of a walk around the pitch or walk around the gym. I want you to clear your mind, grab some water, and come on back. And again, oftentimes we have to leave a problem to solve a problem. Have you ever been trying to solve something, or maybe you have writer's block, and then you step away from it? You go for a walk around the neighborhood, and all of a sudden you have clarity. Well, that can equally be applied to movement skills and movement skill learning as it can to writing a book, for example. And so there's a real positive side of mind wandering through those two lenses. But at the same time, you got to get back to business. And so when we talk about getting back to business, you got to flip them from mind wandering to attentionally focused. And that gets us into this next network that operates, if you would, like a network, but more of a switching station. I use the example of a switching station like at a train station, if you would. And this is what we call the salience network. And so let me spend a little bit of time here because I think it's quite important. And so when we talk about flipping the switch from default relaxed mind wandering to attentional focus, to drawing my attention down to one thing, we have to get this switch to flip. And so how do we do that? And in the book, I spend quite a bit of time talking about this idea of salience. And salience is simply the thing that stands out above all else. And we tend to focus on salient things. In the book, I gave a couple different examples of a background of a bunch of different gray and white images, and then one in the middle was red. Well, this one thing is not like the others. That red thing, that red person in the middle of the image stood out above the rest. Equally, I had a little shot, a little photo of a subway. And in the middle of the subway was a Darth Vader. And again, you don't expect to see Darth Vader on the subway, on the train station, if you would, going from one location to the other. So again, Darth Vader in that moment was the most salient feature. And so oftentimes the way we click someone out of their own head is to bring something into that attentional window that is salient, that is novel, that is interesting. And when we talk about novelty, which is most certainly a salient feature of our environment, there's typically two ways to think about it. And the key is this. On one hand, the things that grab our attention are things that relate to survival. And so we can think about this from an evolutionary perspective. It makes sense that things that could possibly harm us are going to grab onto our attention quicker than anything else, allowing us to step back or step in and evaluate before we decide, is it safe and I can approach, or is it not safe and I need to leave? But ultimately, we're not bringing wild animals and the like onto the training paddock or into the gym. And so we need to switch then to the other kinds of things that we call novel in day-to-day, because they are valuable tools coaches can use to capture attention and flip the switch. And so novel things, very simply put, are unexpected or unfamiliar. And so they tend to stand out above other things. And by their very nature, it makes them salient. So if people are going to get water, blowing the whistle is a salient feature. All of a sudden that stands above all else, and everyone knows based on that whistle, they jog in. If you use someone's name when you are coaching them, rather than just giving them a coaching cue, the second they hear that name, they've been primed to know that the name, their name in particular, is quite important. So that grabs their attention. If you always line up your warm-ups and you do them in a straight line, but one day for your warm-up you say, okay, everyone, get in a circle, that's going to grab everyone's attention. If you ask someone a question, you invite their attention in to solve a problem, that's going to grab their attention. And so I go through many, many different examples around novelty and novelty-seeking behavior. But these are key pragmatic ways to flip the switch, because if we don't have their attention, learning cannot ensue. And so then once we flip the switch, we then get into our actual attention network. So now I'm paying attention, I'm focused. And in the book, I talk about if the salience network helps us capture attention, then rewards and goals help us keep attention. Put simply, you only focus on things long-term that you value, that help you achieve a goal, that reward you in some way. And so when we look at this idea of attention network, that's where we have to be asking ourselves, how can we create sessions and how can we communicate in a way where we create value, where the athlete or the client feels that, okay, if I focus on this cue, it's going to help me perform better. If I complete this exercise or drill, it's going to help me become better. That's what we mean by rewards and goals. And oftentimes, that requires a little bit of explanation. As we like to say, you have to put the why in the what. Why are we doing these drills? Why are we doing these exercises? If they then believe in what you are sharing, they're more likely to pay attention while they're performing them. Equally then, if you give them a cue that makes sense, that draws their attention to the right feature of the movement, that is memorable and allows them to have success in this movement that they feel is important to achieving their goals, again, you've laced your language with rewards and value. And so pragmatically, as I get to this section of the book, when we talk about rewards and goals, we then logically have to shift into this idea of, well, how much can I focus on? I know that I want to switch them to being focused, but once they're focused, how much can I actually put in that attentional window? And that's where, to finish off the chapter, I talk about this idea of one cue per rep, or as I like to say, the one big thing. Because it's not enough just to make your cues or your drills valuable and rewarding. We also have to ensure that they are at a size that the person can actually handle. And as I'll talk about later in the next section, we can only focus on one thing at a time. And so to get the most out of one's attention, it's important that we draw it down to the one big thing. And as I go into the book later on, that's why we talk about one cue, one focus. The second I move from 1 to 2 to 3, what happens? Well, now they have to choose between the 2 cues or the 3 cues. Or arguably they try to think about all 3 at the exact same time unsuccessfully. So even if you are giving great information that they value, that they think is important, if it's more than their attentional network, than their attentional system can handle, ultimately we're still not setting them up for success. And so in sum, use novelty, use interest, use value to capture and keep attention. But once you have that attention, know that it's a limited capacity resource. And therefore, we want to focus it on that one cue, the one big thing. This is going to be a theme that we go back to again and again throughout the book and throughout these sessions. And so ultimately, we must learn to capture and keep attention before we can direct it. And that is the sole purpose of this chapter on attention and the subsequent chapter on memory. If they are not paying attention, then we cannot gain the learning. It's only through attention that we learn. And so once we have their attention, once we've directed at something, now we put them in a position to actually pull it in, to put it onto the hard drive, to remember, if you will. And that's why I called this chapter, Remember When. And so what I thought would be really, really interesting to begin here is go through this idea of how do we actually experience memory? I just finished up our last section talking about how attention is a limited capacity resource. But oftentimes what I find is people are like, well, hold on. My athletes can remember quite a bit. Don't we have short-term memory? Short-term memory can remember a number of things. Can't I give them 2 or 3 cues while they're performing their movement? And I think it's a fantastic question. And it took me a long time to understand the differences between attention and memory. But I think once you understand the differences between attention and memory and how they work together, it'll allow you to understand the principles of coaching at a far higher level. And so here's a cool way to think of it. And I give this example in the chapter. And that is, think of memory as a box. And it's a dark box, or think of it as a room. It's a dark room. And this room can only hold so many objects, so many things. And right, so we can see here, we have a picture of a cheetah, and we have 4 numbers. So here we have 5 things in our working memory. And maybe someone just got some fragments of the last 4 digits of a credit card and they're watching National Geographic at the same time while they're on the phone. I don't know, but they have these random bits of information in their short term or their working memory. Now, this is the holding center for that information. But to actually recall it, to think of the cheetah, to think and say the numbers 4, 3, 5, and 6, we need something that can actually help us pull it into our immediate awareness, pull it into our immediate consciousness, pull it into our immediate attention. And in comes just that, our attentional spotlight. So if memory is the construct, the box, and the amount of things that can fit in it, our attention allows us to say, cheetah. Or, hey, honey, what are you watching? I'm watching this great National Geographic show on cheetahs. In that moment, my attentional spotlight went into my working memory and called upon that. Or if I'm talking now on the phone, oh, yes, I'm back. Yeah, I need the last 4 digits of your credit card. Okay, 4, 3, 5, 6. And so attention allows us to access these pieces of information, one piece of information at a time. It's not like I can say 4, 3, 5, 6 in a singular moment. Notice that. I have to say 4 followed by the 3, the 5, and then the 6. And so what this starts to show us is attention is what we use to access our memory, but equal attention is what we use to access the environment and bring new things into our memory. And hopefully this illustrates as clearly for you as it did for me how attention and memory work together. And I think I'd like to think at least, the book does a pretty good job of showing this relationship throughout, notably chapter 3. And so memory then, in summary, is what we can recall, but attention is how we focus on it. Attention is how we actually recall it. And so these two things work together, but they're fundamentally different. And so this is why, okay, this is the crux of it. You can give someone 2 or 3 cues, fantastic, and they can remember them. It's in their memory. But when they're actually performing the movement, they can only give consideration to one of those at a time in a truly meaningful way. Now, if you're teaching something like a 100-meter sprint and you give 3 cues, one for the start, one for acceleration, and one for maximal velocity, can you get away with doing that? Sure you can, because they use that distinctive focus to get going, right? Then they use that next distinctive focus for acceleration and that final distinctive focus for maximal velocity. But if I'm working with you on your acceleration or on your Olympic lift, in that moment, I need to give you one major thing to think about. And that's not only going to allow you to sample the right information from the environment, but take the information, notably in this case, language, and sample the right amount of information in your mind. And this is going to improve the quality with which you recall information and bring information into the system to form new memories. So relationship, attention and memory, they're related, but they have different roles within the learning process. And so when we now get into this, memory then, right, falls into these 2 different categories. The storage, if you would, falls into these 2 different categories. And in the book, we talk about short-term memory and working memory. For all intents and purposes, they're synonyms. They mean the same thing, but I explain their slight differences in the book. We are going to use the term, as I do in the book, we're going to use working memory. And so working memory is limited in storage capacity. It can't hold that many things. And even though we try to give it a number, as I try to show in the book, when we look at some of these memory challenges where people can remember thousands upon thousands of playing cards, we kind of scratch our head and say, well, hold on. If working memory is how many things I can store in the short term when I'm acutely exposed to them, how does that work? And so ultimately we talk about how a chunk of information is a wide-ranging idea. And the more visual information is, even in the short term when I'm first exposed to it, the more of it I can likely remember. And we go through the exercise in the book called the Memory Palace, which you can reference, right? But we won't get into it now. The key thing is working memory is limited in storage. And so think about this. When you are delivering new information, I'm not just talking about cues here, but delivering new information to a client or an athlete, this is why you want to say the most with the least. You got to ask yourself, for all intents and purposes for today, what's the most important information? If you go back to our last section, I'd then ask you, well, what's your goals of the session today? What are you trying to achieve? Well, only provide information today that's in service of achieving those goals and crafting that focus, right? That's what working memory from a coaching perspective, that's how we should consider it. But ultimately then, we do have this sense that we can remember quite a few things, and that's what we call our long-term memory, which seemingly has unlimited storage. At least that's what we believe. The question, obviously, as a coach is this: how do we get information from working memory to long-term memory, right? How do we move, as I like to say, from a short-term rental to a homeowner, where that information is now permanently imprinted on the hard drive? And that's really what the chapter is about. And we go in far greater detail than I will tonight, but how information can get from working memory to long-term memory, because movements are ultimately memories. Our ability to recall and express a movement at an improved level, day on day, week on week, month on month, is an expression of an improved representation of that information in our memory. And so if we look at working memory, to use an analogy, this is the door into the club, whereas long-term memory itself, well, that's the club. And so the key thing is, if we get attention right, they get through the door. And if we then can keep attention right, that's how we get it locked on the club. And this is, again, why I say attention is the currency of learning. But let's deep dive just one level deeper on working memory and some of the key features that we want to consider to take care of it. And that is this. Number one, it articulates the point I made earlier. We want to keep our messaging brief. If you're like me, you sat in many a team brief that goes on for 45 minutes to an hour, and then they're immediately meant to take all that information and to go apply it from a team sport perspective in practice. Well, oftentimes we talk about mind wandering. There's going to be a lot of shift to mind wandering because it simply is the case we cannot take in all that information. So if you're going to have a meeting that goes for 45 minutes, can we tell a story that ultimately builds on a couple concepts, maybe two or three, that then are the focus point related to the goals of the actual training session? And so for me, you can go longer as long as the actual amount of information they're meant to take away is brief. It's the least amount needed to be successful today. That's what I mean by brief. In a queuing context, we want that briefness literally to be one thing, getting to the one big thing. The second piece is visual. I spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about how do we use language that is visual. We know our visual cortex is huge. And we say things like a picture is worth 1,000 words. Ultimately, we can process and store visual information far easier than we can verbal information in its pure form. But here's the cool thing. We can use verbal information that is visually rich. And so I just give a very simple example. I'm going to give you 3 cues. I may have done this before, so excuse me if I have. 3 cues for sprinting. I've been using these 3 lately. I want you to think about which one's the most memorable. And so if we're trying to teach better hip extension in a sprint, I could say rapidly extend your hips. I could say rapidly push the ground away. Or I could say, imagine that there is a rattlesnake 2 feet behind your ankle about to bite your ankle. Beat the bite. Beat the bite. Well, those are 3 phrases. Arguably, my analogy there at the end, actually word for word, used the highest word count. But if we think about the one where you were able to extract and visualize the meaning and the one that is likely the most memorable, if I said, what was that analogy I used in the working memory section 2 weeks from now, you're probably going to be able to say, beat the bite, the rattlesnake analogy. And so this comes down to visual language allows us to sneak more in to working memory. And that's why this concept of the working memory palace, the memory palace is such an interesting idea and how you can bring it in for deep encoding, as we talked about in the book, from a coaching perspective. The final 2 pieces then is the information relevant? Do they feel it's actually going to help them perform better? And then do they value it? And so this goes back from an attention perspective on how attention, to keep it, there needs to be some kind of reward. I need to be rewarded for paying attention to this information. And so if I'm an athlete and I believe this information I'm getting in the brief is going to make me a better player and is going to help me perform better, or if I'm a general population client, I believe this cue that you're giving me to focus on, or this story that you're telling, the punchline is going to ultimately be a cue, i.e. beat the bite. If I see that there's value there and it's going to help me, I'm more likely to remember it. And so 4 really quick ways to make sure that you're leveraging as best you can working memory. The key thing is this: if we get those 4 things right, we decrease cognitive pollution. Okay? That pollution goes away, clarity of thought, simplicity of thought, very visual, easy to apply. Learning should not be effortful. Actions should be effortful, but the learning itself shouldn't have to be if we follow these 4 principles. So working memory, that's the door to the club. If we want that information to get in, that's where we're talking now long-term memory. And in the book, I talk about a couple different types of long-term memory that I briefly want to review here. And so as we spoke about earlier with focus, long-term memories can be broken into explicit and implicit. Explicit memories typically have to do with experiences, things that we can recall, cognitive semantic information, words, numbers, things that are the province of the conscious mind that require some level of contemplation. In the world of coaching, there are explicit long-term memories that we want our athletes and our clients to retain. And I talk about these being in the case of sport or task knowledge. That's just general information, notably in sport, about the games, the game, the rules, right? Key information about the sport itself. The task itself, if I'm a personal trainer, it could be about the program, the overarching goals of the program, the periodization, how it's going to flow on, so on and so forth. But equally, there's movement knowledge. Well, what's movement knowledge? Well, for this movement, I need to squat to this depth. Technically, my knees tend to track over my toes. My body position is X. It's general, if you would, even biomechanical knowledge that you believe that the client or the athlete needs to know. And this is an important thing to identify, that even though later on in the book, we're going to talk about the kind of cues you use to teach movement, and even though those cues, I'm going to argue, they should be external cues and analogies, there's still oftentimes this overriding movement knowledge that people need to have to trust in the process, to trust in you as a coach, to know what's in front of them, to decrease uncertainty, to increase confidence that they have the capacity to do what is being asked of them. And this is where this kind of explicit knowledge becomes pretty important. But equally, the long-term memories that we're also trying to generate fall into this implicit category. So implicit memories fall into skills and habits. And notably in our world, that's movement execution. And so movement execution in principle doesn't require me to cognitively say shoulder goes here, elbow goes here, wrist goes here. I'm able to perform walking, running, change of direction, jumping without any cognitive thought. The key question, though, that obviously the book articulates in part 2 and part 3 is how can we put the right thoughts in our attentional window to support the development of this implicit learning? And that's where our cues become critically important. And so I think it's interesting as coaches and trainers to recognize that there's different categories of information that we are trying to use and leverage and share. I would say the explicit information is to improve understanding, to improve confidence, to improve knowledge. Whereas the implicit stuff is ability, is skill. They're related to each other, but fundamentally one is explicit and one is implicit. The key, as I've articulated, is learning how to use those explicit cues to generate implicit movement memories. And so knowledge about a movement is not the same as knowing how to perform it. That's the key thing here. And this is really me foreshadowing what part 2 and part 3 are going to be about. That we have to know how to use the right knowledge, the right explicit information to unlock that movement. Both are important, but knowing how they synergize together, that's the key. And so this is why cues, which are by nature explicit memories, I can recall them cognitively and consciously. This is why cues need to be short and accurate enough to retrieve the right movement without overloading the mind. If I have to cognitively think about a lot of information while I am simultaneously trying to recall and perform what is fundamentally a non-conscious movement pattern, we can start to see how that cognitive overload will parlay into paralysis by analysis. And so this is why when we get to the coaching communication loop, we say, hey, here's the knowledge about the movement. But to perform this movement, insert one cue here. Insert one big thing here. How do we get our knowledge, our cues to play nice with our movement? That's going to be central as we move forward in the book club. And so final piece here. I end the chapter with this idea of encoding. And that is how information is encoded, which is to say the initial learning environment. That specific learning environment will dictate my ability to retrieve, to recall that information in the future, whether that's a future practice or a future competition. And I give you this encoding equation so that we express learning by retrieving the right memory at the right time. And these are the 3 pieces. The content I'm trying to learn, the context I learned it in, and the mood I was in. These are 3 critically important pieces when it comes to their ability to remember. And so I want to talk about these briefly. Content is literally the goals of the session. What am I trying to learn? It's my drills, it's my movement, and then within those, it's my goals, whether they're outcome-oriented or process-oriented, right? So the content at the end of the day is the easy piece. The context then is, okay, is the environment I'm learning in one-to-one with the environment I have to perform in? Equally, am I using coaching cues in the learning environment that they can actually use, recall, and apply, let's say in a future learning environment or notably a competitive environment. And then finally, and I think this is a really interesting concept, the mood that we are in when we are learning impacts future recall, such that if I'm in a really positive mood, when I've made an improvement, when I've had the light bulb go off and I've learned something, I'm more likely to recall that experience in a future training session if I'm also in a positive mood. Whereas equally, if I was in a negative mood when I was learning something, I'm more likely to recall that experience when once again, I'm in a negative mood. And so this reinforces that the mood of the environment, the emotions that you are creating in the context of the environment and in your language and your cueing, all of these things are hashtags to the memory. And when conditions in the future equal conditions of now, that is going to promote better learning. But, or I should say better retrieval. But if the way I'm learning the information right now is not similar to the future environment that I'm going to be in when I need to recall it, sometimes you can have the person that appears to be practicing really, really well, but not applying it on game day. And that gets into whole things on how you practice, is there decision-making involved in practice, so on and so forth. But just the key here is think about how the content of what you're teaching, the context you're teaching it in, and the physical mood you're promoting, those work together to ultimately encode the memory. And retrieval depends on how it's encoded. So interesting to think about, plenty of takeaways in the book to apply in the practical environment. Okay, and just finally then, to illustrate this before we shift onto our questions for this evening. And that is this idea of a memorability game. Now, if you haven't done this, I open up the chapter with this, but I think it's a useful exercise. And so this just reinforces how the way we learn things, and if you would, the emotion and the visual nature and the importance and the value and rewards of those things, how it impacts memorability. And so what I'd like you to do is trace your mind back over, let's say, the last, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Pick a time frame. And I want you to identify a pinnacle moment. It could be something really positive or really negative, but something that is memorable, that's important to you. And I want you to go back to that moment. I want you to relive it. What were you wearing? Where were you? How were you feeling? What was around you? Close your eyes and see it for a moment. Okay, you got it? So now you have that memory. And just by asking you a few short questions, you were able to easily recall that. You were able to go back in time and put yourself right into that context. And based on the power of that memory, you were able to step right into it as if you were there once again. Now, park that, remember it. I now want you to think, it's Wednesday. I want you to think back to last Wednesday. Where were you? Now, this might be a bad example considering the time that we find ourselves in, but where were you contextually? What were you wearing? What did you do last Wednesday? What did you have for breakfast, lunch, or dinner? What was important? What stood out on the day? Now, unless last Wednesday was your really important moment, I'm going to argue that you probably had difficulty piecing together the same high definition visual as the one where you thought back to that really important moment. And what that goes to show is this, that insofar as memory, it's not always even how long I've paid attention to something, or even how immediate or how far back it is, but rather the more important something is to you, the more likely you are to recall it. And I want to end this section with that sentiment, because what I want to encourage you to think about is how can you, as a coach, ensure you are creating meaningful, valuable moments in the context and in the way you coach, because that by its very nature increases memorability, which by its very nature supports learning. Because what is learning? At the end of the day, it is the expression of a retrieved memory. And then final here, before we break into questions, I think this is a very nice way to end. Endel Tulving is an absolute critical figure in the memory space. And he said this: memory is the capacity to benefit from past experiences. And what I'm encouraging us to do is to make the highest quality experiences possible that our athletes, clients, and patients can benefit from in the future. And so I've promised on each of these, I was going to give a handful of books. For this specific session, I have 3. I could have come up with quite a few more. The first one is this book, The Mind is Flat. It's a beautiful book about attention and about the mind by Nick Chatter. I highly recommend it. It really gets into this concept of how attention is a limited capacity resource, articulates it beautifully. William James, if you are interested in anything my book talks about, the principles of psychology, William James was talking about these ideas over 100 years ago, clearly, and had them right back then. So an absolute critical individual to study, the father of modern psychology, as he's often referred. And then finally, Winifred Gallagher, the book is called Wrapped, a very eloquent narrative version around attention, and that our life is what we pay attention to. So I think these are 3 different yet related books that you'll be able to get a lot out of when it comes to these ideas of attention and memory. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to pivot now, almost right on time, for our last 30 minutes of questions. And then we can go back to any slides if needs be. And so again, if you have additional questions, I'm just going to go ahead and answer them in the order that they're received here. Throw them in the Q&A box, if you would, instead of our chat box. So I'm going to begin here with our first one from David. I'll do my best to answer as many of these as I can. So David, difference between unconscious and subconscious, and where does automation take place? And so really interesting. Before I started writing the book, I was looking up this idea of unconscious versus non-conscious versus subconscious. And when we look at these 3 terms, even though if we go into neuroscience, they have varying meanings. In terms of our discussion of coaching and popular science, these are synonyms of each other. And so when we think about conscious and non-conscious, to use the non-conscious synonym, conscious are simply things that are within the attentional spotlight. They are things that are subject to cognitive or conscious scrutiny. I can think about them. Whereas subconscious is all the information that is available, but that I'm not currently thinking about. And that's more at a cognitive perspective. Obviously, we have subconscious processes. I haven't had to consciously think about my breathing. I haven't had to consciously think about keeping my organs running correctly, my nervous system, my blood flow. All of that from a biological perspective, we can argue are non-conscious or subconscious processes. But from a cognition perspective, I like to think about as conscious. That's what's currently in the spotlight of my mind, the spotlight of my attention. Subconscious, that's all the information that's there, that's available, that could be accessed, but it's not necessarily being accessed in that exact moment. So David, that's the way that I think about, if you would, unconscious, subconscious, and non-conscious being synonyms and contrasting those versus the conscious mind. Okay, Sabra, welcome back. Can you clarify how the phonological loop, visual spatial sketchpad, and central executive pieces fit with the episodic buffer? Sabra, you are reading this with a scrutinous eye. Beautiful. And so I didn't get into a lot of the scientific jargon this evening simply because I believe that that's best read and deeply understood by the actual medium of reading. But I'm happy to answer this one, Sabra, for you. And so what Sabra is referring to is basically the way our working memory is structured, in that our working memory has these different components that work together, such that the phonological loop, think of phone, relates to how we actually process verbal information. Whereas the visual spatial sketchpad, it's a sketchpad. It is visual. It's how we process visual information. And so that's, if you would, the 2 types of information we can store in that dark room. The central executive then, that's our attention. That's the spotlight that is looking at this verbal information in a cognitive sense and looking at this visual information in a cognitive sense. But as you are hearing new information, even this evening for the first time, does that new information spark a past memory? Oh, I've experienced that. Even when I asked you earlier to think about something that happened to you years ago and bring that forward, you needed to have a way to sample your past, to sample your long-term memory. And that's what's referred to as the episodic buffer. Think of a buffer like a bridge. And so in the short term, we got this verbal stuff, we've got this visual stuff. We've got this spotlight that can look at it. And then there's this back door that can grab information from our past and bring it right into our conscious mind, into our working memory for consideration. That's how the phonological loop, the visual spatial sketchpad, the central executive, and the episodic buffer work together, giving you your collective sense of consciousness that seamlessly samples the past, the present, and the future at will. So very good question, Sabra. Hopefully that answered it for everybody. Derek Bark, thank you for your question. How long do you use a cue with an athlete before changing the approach if it doesn't seem to be working? For instance, in the example of driving the knees forward like breaking glass in front of you, should you see immediate change, or will you need to continue using this cue for a little while to see if you have made progress with them? Derek, since you took the time to write such a thoughtful question, I'll go ahead and answer it this evening, because I think even though we'll talk about these type of ideas in detail in the next session, it bears repeating. And so here's the way I look at cueing. First of all, if I give one cue, should I see an immediate effect? Well, at the very least, I shouldn't see them worsen. If a cue results in them immediately worsening, that's going to be a moment for pause. And so that's where, if we talk about the coaching communication loop, I go right into my debrief. And so let's use the instance where a cue made someone worse. I'm going to ask them, how did that feel to you? Do you feel that it improved the movement? Did it make it worse? I might ask a specific question. Let's say we're talking about ground contact. Did it feel lighter? Did it feel heavier? And what I'm trying to understand is, did they understand the cue as it was intended? I might even repeat the cue back to them. Okay, so I asked you to drive your knee forward as if to break a pane of glass. What does that mean to you? And they might say, well, I'm trying to move my knees really quickly. And you're like, that's not what I meant. Obviously, you're saying this in your own head. What I meant is I want them to drive their knee forward explosively. And you can say, okay, awesome. Instead of this time thinking about trying to move really quickly, I want you to imagine it's a big pane of glass. And I need you to drive that knee forward to bust through it. Be as powerful as you break through that glass as possible. And so in that case, we can see it was a misunderstanding of the cue. That's why either they were worse or possibly there was no change at all. Equally, if there's no change at all, they focused on the cue correctly, they might need a couple repetitions. And so for me, Derek, not to pass the buck, I'm going to have to put this one back on you to think about how many repetitions. But if I'm thinking about sprint work, if I don't get a change off a cue within 2 to 3 repetitions, then for me, I'm probably going to think about refining it a little bit, assuming that I've accurately identified the cue, meaning I've identified the right problem to fix, and the meaning behind the cue is correct as well. I might refine it a little bit. But ultimately, if I'm not getting a change, however, they're feeling inside, yeah, it feels better, I feel like I'm getting closer, then I'm going to stick with it. And obviously, if it makes a big improvement, and that improvement is being maintained by focusing on that cue, then I'm going to stick with it as long as the cue seems to be potent. But the second I see them start to lose motivation, lose energy, maybe even a slight regression of the technique, then I'm going to look at refining and updating the cue. As much as the book is about science, Derek and everyone, that specific question is one of the most important pieces related to the art. And so you have to suss out, are they ready for a new cue? Do they need a reinforcement? But the first step and the most important is, did they hear the cue? Did they focus on it? And did they apply it with the same meaning as you intended? If you can get to that point, I believe that debrief after every single repetition is going to tell you if you need to refresh it, refine it, or retire it. Thank you, Derek. Very good question. Okay, Vanessa. There is a condition called aphantasia. That is, a person has no inner eye to visualize using images. How would that influence the cueing? Have you experienced working with athletes with similar conditions? Concerning the memory games, I was much better with game 1, the random words, not game 2, the story. Could this be connected with the missing, not well-developed visual capabilities? Yeah, you know what, Vanessa, that is a fantastic question. And so most certainly we know that individuals' capacity for motor imagery, for visualization, which is what Vanessa is referring to, that varies across individuals. You know, on the whole, if you were to default to using visually oriented language, I think you're probably going to have success more often than not. But as Vanessa articulates, that's most certainly not the case for everyone. And I think it was in the last session that I gave the example that when you have someone on intake come into training, if you were to show them a picture of a movement, could be a sprint, a jump, a change of direction, an RDL, a bench press, doesn't matter. And you were then to list out some various, let's say, pure external cues and then some analogies. Whereas by their very nature, analogies tend to be more visual, if you would, than just pure external cues, i.e. push the ground away versus get off the line like a snake is about to bite your ankle. If they start to choose more of the literal cues that are less visual, then Vanessa, we might default more to just more verbal information. Give them literal description of what the task is and the outcome you want them to achieve. Equally, rather than using language to ask them to visualize, you might physically show them a visual, and so that they can look at that visual versus asking them to replay in the mind. And this is where I think things like the VARC scale and other what is typically called learning style assessments can be beneficial. Now, in my opinion, I think the evidence is there to back this. There's no such thing as a learning style and that I can only learn one way, but it's this idea of learning preferences. And so Vanessa, if I was working with you and I say, do you typically like to have things explained more literally, or do you like more of a visual? And you were to say, Nick, I prefer things to be more literal, then I would go through the effort of saying, okay, here's the movement, explain it in its simple biomechanics, show you a visual. That's the describe and demonstrate I talk about in the communication loop in chapter 4. And then from there, I'm going to give you a very straight talking, simple, literal external cue. I need you to push the ground away. I need you to explode out and up. And so from there, I'm trying to leverage my language and leverage my coaching style in service of your preferences. Or in the case of someone actually, let's say, being wired a little bit differently or more towards less or more visual in a way that jives with how you like to learn. And so Vanessa, it's a great question. I can't say myself, I've worked with many individuals that fall in or have that condition, but most certainly I've read about it, and I think you're very, very wise, and it's appropriate to bring it up. So thank you. Okay, Fabio. Charles Poliquin prefers to train dopamine-dominant athletes, clients with intensity and variety. What is your opinion on identifying the best way to program and train them? You know, Fabio, it is a very good question, but I think in spirit of what we're talking about right now, from coaching and coaching language, attention, and memory, that why don't you email me at info@thelanguageofcoaching.com, and we can go ahead and talk about that one offline. Okay. Fiona, how do you handle the question, where should I feel this? I don't really want to encourage that kind of internal focus, so I don't really want to answer, but don't know how to handle the question well otherwise. Fiona, it's a beautiful question. I think last time we talked about awareness as well, and I get into it in chapter 5. There's a specific section on body awareness. And so let's talk about it briefly now. In my opinion, and I'll be very clear, I think this is an area that is not well understood within the motor learning and language, let's say, domain, is that body awareness, being aware of the body, and a strict internal cue or internal focus, I don't believe that those are the exact same thing. And let me explain. If I tell you to extend your hip during a jump, I am giving you a very constrained internal cue. I'm giving you a singular focus point to prioritize that part of the body, even though you are doing a multi-joint movement. It's top down, it's very intentional. Versus if I asked you to be aware of your hips or aware of how your hips feel on a scale from loose to tight, I haven't actually given you a cue on how to control your hips or how to control your movement, or even a specific outcome of what you should feel in your hips. I've simply asked you to take your attentional spotlight like an observer and simply watch, notice from a proprioceptive, a sensory perspective, what is going on there. And while for some, Fiona, I think you're right to identify, that might promote overt internal control. It almost goes back to Vanessa's question. We need to understand the person that we are working with. For some people, self-awareness type questions might cause them to overthink. But it's not necessarily because self-awareness by itself is inherently bad. It's only if that self-awareness gets them to think about controlling their hips in the example that I've given. And so in many cases, especially as someone becomes more and more expert-like, I will use many what we might call awareness cues. Hey, I want you to be awareness of how you felt coming off the ground. Or I want you to be awareness of the height of your body during the movement. If you felt short and scrunched versus long and tall, I want you to be aware of the looseness, the whip in your hip. And so we need to study. Are these cues better or worse than external? I do not know, but for me, I use them. And because awareness requires something to have already happened for you to be aware of it, it is not, and I can say this with confidence, it is the same thing as giving an internal cue where I'm trying to physically control that joint. And so I encourage you to play around with it, Fiona. Find out different ways to ask. Most certainly use awareness-based questions in your debrief, and ultimately form it to the person that you are working with. Really good question. Okay, Stuart. Obviously, this book is about language we use, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how this information, specifically attention, learning, and memory, relate to CLA. So when we look at CLA, we are talking about, constraints or a constraint-led approach and the language we choose to use with our athletes. And so basically this is asking, how does the physical environment we create, the drills and the constraints and the cues we use, how do they marry up or possibly work against each other? And so I lay this out a number of times in the book, but for me, there's perfect synergy between the way we talk about an external focus and the way we talk about constraints. If constraints are a change in the environment to encourage one movement over another, let's give an example here. So one of the most common constraints we see, at least in the sports sector I come from, relate to running. And Franz Bosch, who's a good friend of mine, he has a constraint that he uses where he puts a dowel on people's shoulder while they're running as fast as they can. So normally we run with our arms, but instead we put a dowel on the shoulder. What the dowel starts to do is a number of different things. One, the second I don't have my arms to balance my lower body, any asymmetries in the lower body, we become much more aware of. Equally, if I don't have my arms available, which normally I would put out in front of me to protect a fall, let's say, if they're behind me, immediately I start to think about being much more, not think about, but I start to feel that a more upright position feels normal. And if I'm in a more upright, stiff position, that creates a better foundation for my knee to come up from a hip flexion perspective and allows me then to have a better drive down into the ground. Now, these are all things, assuming I have the mobility, stability, strength, and power to achieve it, these are all things that naturally happen without having to give a cue. However, I find for many athletes, a constraint sometimes is enough, but more often than not, it's not, and we still need to give a cue. And so if I'm having them do that constraint, I can simply give a cue, I want you to focus on getting tall. Or back to the example I gave earlier, as you are running, I want you to think about driving that thigh up through the sparring mitt of a pad, right? Hit the pad, hit the pad. And what that starts to do is it takes the natural tendency of the constraint to put me in a tall, better knee drive position. But now the cue allows me to accentuate that environmental feature that my attention should be drawn to anyway, which is getting tall and driving my knee up. So the feeling that the constraint is trying to create and the feeling in the body to try to change the movement can then be accentuated with how I focus. Ultimately, the constraint is in the environment and the external focus directs my attention to that same feature of the environment. They work together top down and bottom up to drive the change we're looking for. And so for me, I think there's beautiful partnership between getting the language right and the constraints right. Ultimately, external draws us to the environment, and constraint is a shift in the environment. So, Stuart, that's a great question. And in the future, I actually would like to do a couple blog posts on how those two things synergize together. Okay, Sabra, another question here. Do you know if there are any readings or articles out there on how the ability to move or stay within attention, salient, and default mode differs when it comes to typical brains versus those that may have ADHD, autism spectrum, etc.? Really, really good question, Sabra. I haven't gotten that deep into the literature. So the short answer is no. Do I believe, based on my readings, that literature exists? Yes. Do we have information on external focus and attentional focus from a cueing perspective across various abilities and those with various disabilities? Most certainly. And Sabra, we can talk about those articles directly. And for anyone else who's interested in that, again, email me, info@thelanguageofcoaching.com. Okay, a few more questions here. Aaron, what's your view on giving athletes a focus break from a specific learning task by getting them to do a different fun task in a team sport? Aaron, that is a fantastic question. And I think that's exactly what I was alluding to when I talked about mind wandering and the default mode network, that if we're constantly drawing someone down to be attentionally focused, if you were trying to draw them into that flow state, which is a common buzzword that we hear all the time, sometimes I need to give them a reprieve. And that's that proverbial, nothing worth considering has ever been thought, when not moving. And so, this is the famous, all great thoughts were conceived while walking, or all great ideas were conceived while walking. And so if I have a very attentionally demanding task, absolutely, I think the cognitive break is as important, if not more important, than the water break itself. So strategically building those in and encouraging then people to go for the walk, to reflect, and then come back. Whether these are baked into your training session or you use them ad hoc, seeing that people need a bit of a break. I know for me, I've had sessions where you could just tell players were not up for it, and we shut it down and we pivot to a recovery session. And I think both, there's a benefit there physically, because the last thing you want to do is put someone at a physical risk, but also if they don't have enough cognitive energy to attack what you're trying to do from a learning perspective, and they're not deploying attention correctly, well, I think we now know, because I've talked about it ad nauseum, that if they can't pay attention, they're not going to extract what they need from the session. So I think you're wise to identify and ask that question. Using those mind-wandering breaks can be really beneficial to offload that attentional demand. Okay, John, should the use of the athlete's name be limited to instances when we are really trying to grab their awareness, or should we try to use name as much as possible to heighten overall awareness? Basically, I'm wondering if we're constantly using their name, do we remove the element of novelty and weaken it? 100%. If novelty is all about the unfamiliar or the unexpected, if I'm using names with everybody all the time, it doesn't necessarily the same level of weight or interest. Now, the reality is every time you say Nick, I'm gonna be turning to you, right? Because that's my name, and I wanna see what's gonna happen after that. At the same time, if you're using it as a constant tact, I do think it will lose a little bit of its energy. And inevitably, even if it draws my attention in, if it also shifts my mood to, oh my goodness, again, it's going to taint that experience. So I think implied in your question is the answer you're looking for. Use it often, right? But use it selectively. It should primarily be for those moments that are really important, whether it's a positive emotional piece, good job, great job, keep it up, because you're using them as a model, or if you're trying to get information across. Absolutely. Okay, Aaron. Nick, brilliant as always. Thank you so much. Really impactful. Are there considerations about how to convey ideas of focus and cueing when it comes to adolescence? Would you alter any of the information conveyed in the book when teaching a 12-year-old, for example? Aaron, that's a really great question. For me, I think of all the chapters that get into that, we're really talking about chapter 6. And chapter 6, going analog, talks about this idea of meeting a person where they're at. And the fact that when we utilize language in cues and notably analogies, we need to utilize language that they are familiar with. And so let's be honest, the language and the experiences on which that language is based for a 12-year-old is very different than a 21-year-old. And so what I often see happens is, if we are utilizing analogies and examples that that child can't connect with, it doesn't matter how clever or how good the cue is, it's not going to land. And equally, if we're using childish type language and analogies with our 21-year-old, they might feel we're undermining them and they're not connecting with it. And so for me, it's about understanding what's that 12-year-old interested in. Do they like superheroes? What are their hobbies? What do they do for fun? If I can identify what those features of their lived world are, I can leverage that information when I'm coaching them. And so with my son, my son is turning 5 next month. He loves superheroes. He loves Paw Patrol. He loves Disneyland. He loves physical activities. And so I use those real life examples that he can relate to when I'm trying to coach him. And for me, I do think it is that simple when we work with kids. We also have to remember that their brain is still developing. And so the amount of information and working memory is going to be a strain with a younger kid versus someone with a fully matured brain. And so it goes back still to those same principles. Keep it brief, keep it visual, keep it relevant. What's relevant to a 12-year-old? If you haven't asked yourself that question, ask that, and therein lies the information you need to coach them. So great question, Aaron. Scott Walker, how do you manage to keeping talking for so long without an or ah, or even like you are thinking like you've done this all before, even when answering novel questions? Scott, that is a very, very good question. It's taken years and years of practice. It's never perfect, but it's always a matter of progress. So I appreciate the compliment implied in the question. Great, Fabio. Thank you. Just shoot me an email when you can. AJ, following Fabio's thread, would you borrow from the strategy that personalizing the instructions and cues based on a mental assessment of an athlete? Again, just generally speaking, if you have any kind of assessment to better understand, and I like the word preferences of the individual, I think those do not hurt. Understanding a person's preferences will absolutely lend itself for you to use language that supports them. At the very least, they know that you've been listening and care about them. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in what those assessments might be, but if there are assessments that lend themselves to personality tendencies or learning preferences, I think they can be a fantastic tool to learn who's in front of you. Okay. A few more questions here, and then we are coming to the end. Anonymous, how would you handle cueing clients with dyspraxia and a lack of short-term memory? Is there similar ways of cueing that uses the planning loop? In my opinion, where you're going to have individuals from a language perspective that are going to be limited, and most certainly memory is going to be limited, I'd use visuals. I'm really hoping that our industry takes on board what I'm trying to do with all of these visuals. Ultimately, these visuals are not just meant for you as the coaches and the trainers reading the book and the therapists reading the book. It's also meant to be things that you can physically show people, creating literally visual analogies to help people learn. And I've already seen on Instagram some people starting to create their own. So I would encourage you to expand your idea of what coaching and cueing is beyond just language. If we start to, even just in PowerPoint, create these single slides that start to create visual analogies, print them off, put them on a D-ring, and there you go. Those can be some go-to visual analogies you use to teach. Last two questions here. Chris, thoughts on when you get it right, mark the spot from a cueing standpoint? Coil tip number 29 from the Little Book of Talent. Yeah, for me, I usually call these the Kool-Aid reps. When someone has really done something fantastic, we absolutely mark the spot in the debrief. We talk about how it felt. We talk about the language we use, the experience we use to get there, and we want to make sure it becomes very memorable. So for me, like, for example, tonight, my daughter, she got a report card back, and it was really positive marks, and the teacher said some really positive things about her. So we marked the spot. Tonight, she's having an impromptu movie night with popcorn. We want to put a positive mood, a positive experience around a well-earned moment. I think the exact same thing goes when you're coaching and you're cueing. So during that debrief, let's spend a little bit extra effort to highlight this was important. The way we achieved this important moment was through the cue and through your hard work. And that's how I would approach it. I think it's a great question and a great application of his principle. Stuart, thank you so much. Thank you, Stuart, for joining us. Tyler, last question here from Tyler Hartley. In running, will hard workouts on a race course that you will soon be running on help build confidence in a code, positive memories. Tyler, I love it. Implied in so much of the encoding section of the book, 100%. This is why there's so much research that one of the best ways to prepare for a test is to physically go to the testing environment and take the test there. So not only taking tests is a great way to prepare for testing, but doing it in the physical environment. So if I was to go back to college, assuming I could get access to the physical venue where the testing might take place, similar to Tyler, what you're talking about on running the race course before you actually play, 100%. That relates to context encoding. So if I get context together, which is what you're suggesting, it is going to improve retrieval when I step back into that context, which in this case is the race course. So wonderful question. And that is it for us this evening on the question front. I'm just going to pull up my slides to debrief with the final group of you that is still held on. Thank you so much for those of you that are still here. So a couple pieces of information, which I'm sure you already have. Our next book club is on July 1st, 2 weeks from now. Hopefully give you enough time to read chapters 4 and 5. Not that tonight and June, on our last session, they were very exciting for me as well, but now we really get into the heartbeat of the book. We're going to start talking about focus and how we guide it and craft it with our language. We'll talk about the coaching communication loop, our continuum of cues, and our 3D cueing model. So I am through the roof excited for that next one. Hopefully you'll join us. Tonight's recording will go up on YouTube. Session 1 is already up there. Again, it's the language of coaching. If you want to stay in tune with this and all the other pieces I'm doing, if you haven't yet, go over to thelanguageofcoaching.com and subscribe. And as a final piece from me to you, if I can ask, if you have the book, you're enjoying it, and you believe in what I'm sharing, and you believe our industry needs this, can I ask you to head over to Amazon and leave a review? It greatly supports the grassroots effort of getting the book out there, and I'd be ever so grateful for those of you that believe in it to take that extra bit of time and review it on Amazon. In the meantime, I wish you all the best. Stay safe in your endeavors, especially as the world is opening up, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Cheers.